Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Gunnar Sønsteby, a man whose life became synonymous with courage, resilience, and the indomitable spirit of resistance. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the day's demands have faded and the mind seeks both rest and meaning, we turn to stories that remind us of humanity's capacity for extraordinary bravery in the face of overwhelming darkness. The story of Gunnar Sønsteby is one such tale, a narrative that unfolds not with the thunder of grand proclamations, but with the steady, determined footsteps of a man who chose to stand against tyranny when surrender seemed the easier path. Born into a Norway that knew peace, Gunnar Sønsteby would become the most highly decorated citizen of his nation, a distinction earned not through seeking glory, but through countless acts of quiet defiance that collectively helped to preserve the soul of a country under occupation. His life serves as a testament to the power of individual conviction, to the idea that one person, armed with determination and purpose, can indeed make a difference in the great sweep of history. As we journey through his story tonight, let us do so with a sense of calm reflection, understanding that the lessons embedded in his experiences transcend the specific time and place of his struggles. This is a story about choices, the choice to resist when compliance would have been safer, the choice to risk everything for principles that could not be seen or touched, the choice to believe in a future of freedom even when the present offered only oppression. The early years, foundations of character. Gunnar Fridtjof Thurman Sønsteby was born on January 11, 1918, in the small town of Rjukan, nestled in the mountainous region of Telemark in southern Norway. The landscape of his childhood was one of dramatic beauty: towering peaks, deep valleys, rushing waterfalls, and the ever-present sense of nature's power. Rjukan itself was a relatively modern town, established around the hydroelectric power facilities that harnessed the mighty Rjukan Falls, and this combination of natural grandeur and industrial innovation would prove formative in shaping the young Gunnar's worldview. His family was working class, grounded in the practical realities of daily life, yet imbued with the strong moral framework that characterized much of Norwegian society in the early 20th century. Norway at this time was a young nation, having gained full independence from Sweden only in 1905, and the Norwegian people possessed a fierce pride in their sovereignty and democratic traditions. The values of hard work, honesty, community solidarity, and a deep connection to the land were not merely abstract ideals, but lived realities that shaped how people understood their place in the world. Gunnar's father worked in the industrial facilities that made Rjukan economically viable, and from an early age, young Gunnar understood the dignity of labor and the importance of contributing to the community's well-being. The rhythms of industrial work, its demands for precision, timing, and reliability, would later prove surprisingly relevant to his work in the Resistance, where operations required the same careful planning and flawless execution that characterized any complex industrial process. But it was not all work and seriousness in young Gunnar's life. The mountains and forests of Telemark offered endless opportunities for adventure and exploration. He learned to ski almost as soon as he could walk, a common experience for Norwegian children, and developed an intimate knowledge of the terrain around his home. He learned to navigate by the stars and the sun, to read the weather in the clouds and wind, to find shelter and sustenance in landscapes that could be unforgiving to the unprepared. These skills, learned in play and recreation, would later become tools of survival and resistance. The Norway of Gunnar's youth was a society that valued education, and despite his working-class background, opportunities existed for those willing to apply themselves. Gunnar proved to be an intelligent and capable student, though not one given to academic pretension. His intelligence was practical rather than theoretical, grounded in problem-solving and concrete action rather than abstract philosophizing. He learned not for the sake of learning alone, but because knowledge enabled action, because understanding the world meant being better equipped to navigate its challenges. As Gunnar moved into his teenage years, the world beyond Norway's borders was growing increasingly turbulent. The Great Depression cast its shadow across Europe, creating economic hardship and political instability. In Germany, the Nazi Party rose to power, transforming that country with frightening speed into a militarized, totalitarian state driven by an ideology of racial supremacy and territorial expansion. Yet for young Gunnar, these events seemed distant, belonging to a world beyond the mountains that surrounded his home. He completed his education and, like many young Norwegian men, was called up for military service. This was standard practice in Norway, a nation that maintained armed neutrality and required its citizens to contribute to national defense. Gunnar served his time dutifully, learning the basics of military organization, discipline, and combat. The training was thorough, if not extensive. Norway's military was small, reflecting the nation's limited resources and its hope that neutrality would shield it from the conflicts that seemed to be brewing in Europe. When Gunnar completed his military service, he moved to Oslo, Norway's capital, seeking opportunities in the larger city. He found work as a bookkeeper, a position that suited his meticulous nature and his facility with numbers and organization. It was steady, respectable work, offering a modest but secure living. He rented a small apartment, established routines, made friends among his colleagues. His life was ordinary in the best sense of the word, filled with the simple pleasures of youth, the satisfaction of honest work, the promise of a future that seemed predictable and peaceful. Oslo in the late 1930s was a vibrant city, cosmopolitan by Norwegian standards, where culture, commerce, and politics intersected. Cafes and restaurants offered gathering places for spirited discussions about current events. Theaters and cinemas provided entertainment. The city's newspapers brought news from around the world, and that news was increasingly alarming. Germany had annexed Austria, then Czechoslovakia. The Spanish Civil War had provided a preview of the horrors of modern warfare and totalitarian ideology. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the great European democracies of Britain and France finally declared war. Norway, like its Scandinavian neighbors, declared neutrality. The government hoped, as it had during the First World War, that staying out of the conflict would preserve Norwegian sovereignty and spare its people the horrors of war. But even as official policy maintained neutrality, thoughtful Norwegians understood that the world was changing in ways that might not respect their desire to remain apart from the conflict. German aggression seemed insatiable, and Norway's strategic location, controlling the long coastline along the North Atlantic and providing access to Swedish iron ore through northern ports, made it far too valuable to ignore. Gunnar Sønsteby, now in his early 20s, followed these developments with growing concern. He was not politically radical, not given to ideological fervor, but he possessed a clear moral sense and a deep love for his country. The idea that Norway might be drawn into this conflict, that the freedom and democracy his people had fought to establish might be threatened, was deeply troubling. Yet what could one ordinary young man do? He had no special skills, no particular influence, no reason to believe that he would be called upon to do anything more than what millions of others would do. Try to survive. Try to protect those he loved. try to maintain some semblance of normal life, whatever might come. Then, on April 9, 1940, everything changed. The invasion, a nation-stunned dawn, broke over Oslo that April morning, with no hint of the catastrophe about to unfold. The city stirred to life as it always did, people beginning their daily routines, unaware that this day would mark a fundamental rupture in their nation's history. Then came the sounds, unfamiliar, alarming sounds. The drone of aircraft engines, many aircraft, more than anyone had ever seen in Norwegian skies. The thunder of explosions, the rattle of gunfire, and then the messages, spreading through the city with the speed of panic. Germany was invading Norway. The assault was swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. German forces had struck simultaneously at multiple points along the Norwegian coast, seizing key cities and strategic positions before effective resistance could be organized. Warships appeared in harbors, paratroopers dropped from the sky, ground forces moved swiftly along roads and railways. The Norwegian military, small and unprepared for an attack of this scale and sophistication, found itself struggling to respond to an invasion that seemed to be everywhere at once. In Oslo, Gunnar Sønsteby watched his world transform with stunning speed. German troops appeared in the streets, establishing control over government buildings, transportation hubs, communication facilities. The Norwegian government, forced to flee the capital, began a fighting retreat northward, hoping to establish a defensive line and maintain sovereign authority over at least part of the country. But the military situation was hopeless. Germany's Wehrmacht was the most formidable military machine in the world, blooded by campaigns in Poland and seasoned by aggressive training. Norway's small armed forces, however brave, were simply no match. The invasion of Norway was motivated by clear strategic considerations. Control of Norway would secure Germany's northern flank, ensure access to Swedish iron ore shipped through Norwegian ports, and provide naval bases from which to threaten British sea lanes in the North Atlantic. It would also preempt potential Allied plans to use Norway as a base for operations against Germany. For the Norwegian people, these strategic calculations meant nothing compared to the immediate reality of occupation. Foreign soldiers in their streets, foreign rule imposed on their government, foreign ideology seeking to reshape their society. Within weeks, the military campaign was effectively over. British and French forces had attempted to assist Norway, landing troops in the central and northern regions, but these interventions were poorly coordinated and ultimately ineffective. By early June, facing the collapse of France and desperate to recall their forces to defend their own territory, the Allies evacuated from Norway. King Haakon VII and the Norwegian government went into exile in London, maintaining the legal continuity of Norwegian sovereignty, but unable to offer any practical assistance to their occupied homeland. Norway was alone. For Gunnar Sønsteby, as for millions of Norwegians, the shock of occupation was followed by a period of uncertainty and soul-searching. What should one do? How should one respond? The German authorities, through their Norwegian collaborators, urged acceptance of the new reality. They promised that those who cooperated would be treated well, that life could continue more or less normally under the new order. They pointed to Germany's military power and insisted that resistance was futile. They spoke of a new Europe in which Norway would have an honored place among the Germanic peoples. But there were others who rejected this narrative from the outset. These were people who understood that Nazi ideology was fundamentally incompatible with Norwegian values, that collaboration meant complicity in crimes that violated basic human decency, that surrender of principle in the face of power was a form of moral death. Some of these people were motivated by political conviction, some by religious faith, some by an inchoate sense that certain lines simply could not be crossed. Gunnar Sønsteby was among them. He did not make any dramatic declaration or sudden decision. Resistance, for him, emerged gradually, organically, from his fundamental understanding of right and wrong. He began by refusing to cooperate with German orders when he could do so without immediate consequence. He passed along information when he heard it, small pieces of intelligence about German movements or intentions. He connected with others who shared his views, finding that in a city under occupation, one could identify the like-minded through careful conversation and subtle signals. These early acts of resistance were modest, even trivial by later standards. But they represented something crucial, a refusal to accept the occupation as permanent or legitimate, a determination to preserve some zone of autonomy and defiance even when overwhelming force demanded submission. Gunnar understood instinctively what more passive citizens did not. That occupation depended not just on military power, but on the occupied population's willingness to comply. Every act of non-cooperation, however small, subtracted from the occupier's effective control. The formation of resistance, finding purpose in darkness. As 1940 turned to 1941 and the occupation settled into a grim routine, Norwegian resistance began to take more organized forms. The early, spontaneous acts of defiance, wearing red caps representing the Norwegian flag, gathering for patriotic demonstrations, refusing to salute German soldiers, gave way to more structured opposition. Underground newspapers appeared, defying German censorship to report accurate news and maintain morale. Networks formed to help Allied airmen shot down over Norway escape to Sweden. Intelligence gathering became more systematic, with information being passed to the Norwegian government in London and through them to the British. Gunnar Sønsteby found his way into one of these developing networks. His background made him useful. He was intelligent, discreet, utterly reliable, and his work as a bookkeeper gave him legitimate reasons to move around the city and interact with various people without arousing suspicion. More importantly, he possessed personal qualities that marked him as suited for resistance work. He was calm under pressure, careful in his assessment of people and situations, and possessed an almost preternatural ability to sense danger. The resistance group he joined called itself Company Linge, or the Linge Company, named after Captain Martin Linge, a Norwegian officer who had escaped to Britain and was organizing Norwegian forces there for special operations. The company was focused on sabotage and intelligence gathering, working in coordination with the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, which had been established specifically to conduct irregular warfare in occupied Europe. Gunnar's education in resistance work began in earnest. He learned the tradecraft of clandestine operations, how to maintain cover stories, how to identify and evade surveillance, how to communicate through dead drops and coded messages, how to compartmentalize operations so that the compromise of one cell would not endanger others. He learned to live with constant risk, to function normally while carrying knowledge that could mean death if discovered. He learned that successful resistance required not dramatic heroism, but patient, methodical work, attention to detail, and the discipline to subordinate personal feelings to operational necessity. The work was dangerous in ways that varied from the dramatic to the mundane. There was the obvious danger of confrontation with German security forces, arrest, interrogation, torture, execution. These were real threats, and members of the resistance lived with them constantly. But there were also the more subtle dangers, the informer who seemed trustworthy, the careless word overheard by the wrong person, the pattern of behavior that drew attention, The simple bad luck of being in the wrong place when the Germans decided to conduct random checks. Gunnar proved adept at navigating these dangers. His natural caution, combined with carefully cultivated awareness of his surroundings, allowed him to sense when situations were becoming dangerous and to extract himself before trouble materialized. He developed an almost sixth sense for detecting surveillance, for identifying people who didn't belong in a particular setting, for recognizing when a random document check might not be random at all. These abilities, refined through practice and occasionally learned through narrow escapes, would keep him alive through 5 years of increasingly dangerous operations. As his involvement deepened, Gunnar took on more significant roles. He became involved in planning sabotage operations, identifying vulnerable targets in the German war effort. He helped organize the logistics of resistance operations, securing safe houses, arranging transportation, managing the movement of supplies and weapons. He participated in intelligence gathering, collecting information about German military dispositions, supply lines, and plans. Each operation required careful preparation, precise execution, and calm withdrawal. Each success added to the resistance's capabilities and confidence. Each failure threatened to unravel the entire network. The psychological burden of this work was immense. Gunnar lived a double life, appearing to all outward observation as an ordinary citizen going about his ordinary business, while constantly engaged in activities that could bring sudden and violent death. He had to monitor his every word, control his every reaction, present a facade of normalcy while his mind raced with operational details and potential dangers. He could not confide in family members, could not seek comfort or counsel from those outside the resistance. The isolation was profound, a loneliness that existed in the midst of a crowded city. Yet there were compensations. The resistance provided a sense of purpose that transcended the daily humiliations and frustrations of occupation. It offered the conviction that one was actually doing something, making a difference, contributing to eventual liberation, however distant that might seem. It created bonds of extraordinary depth with fellow resistance members, people who trusted each other with their lives, who shared dangers that could not be explained to anyone else, who found in their common struggle a form of fellowship that peacetime life rarely produced. Gunnar also found that he was good at this work, better than he had imagined possible. He discovered in himself reserves of courage, ingenuity, and determination he had not known existed. The challenges of resistance work, the need for quick thinking, improvisation, bold action balanced by careful planning, suited his temperament perfectly. He was not reckless, but neither was he paralyzed by fear. He could assess risks rationally, make decisions under pressure, and execute plans with the precision his work demanded. As 1941 progressed and Germany invaded the Soviet Union, then as the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the strategic landscape shifted. The war was now truly global, and ultimate German victory no longer seemed assured. The resistance in Norway, like resistance movements across occupied Europe, drew encouragement from these developments. But they also knew that Germany remained enormously powerful, that liberation might be years away, and that their work would need to continue regardless of how long that took. Sabotage and operations. The art of striking back. By 1942, the Norwegian Resistance had evolved from a collection of loosely connected groups into a more coordinated organization. The central leadership, working in exile in London, maintained contact with resistance cells inside Norway through radio communication, courier networks, and occasional insertions of agents by air or sea. The British SOE provided training, equipment, and strategic direction, though the Norwegians themselves made the operational decisions and bore the risks. Gunnar Sønsteby was by this time recognized as one of the most capable operatives in Oslo, and he was given increasingly important assignments. One of the fundamental challenges facing the resistance was identifying targets whose destruction would genuinely impair the German war effort without causing unacceptable civilian casualties. Norway's occupation served Germany primarily as a source of raw materials, a strategic position for military operations, and a labor pool for the war economy. Sabotage operations therefore focused on disrupting production, transportation, and communication infrastructure that served these purposes. Gunnar participated in numerous sabotage operations during this period, each one requiring weeks of preparation. The target had to be surveyed, its vulnerabilities identified, its guard routines observed. The materials for the attack, usually explosives, had to be obtained, transported to the vicinity of the target, and concealed until needed. The operatives had to plan their approach, their escape routes, their contingency plans if things went wrong. And then came the operation itself, moving through the darkness, placing the charges, setting the timers, withdrawing before detection, and then the agonizing wait to see if the operation would succeed. One particularly significant operation targeted the German-controlled workshops and factories in Oslo that were repairing and maintaining military equipment. These facilities were crucial to German operations in Norway, allowing damaged equipment to be returned to service rather than having to be shipped back to Germany. Gunnar helped plan and execute an operation that destroyed several of these workshops, setting back German repair capabilities by months. The operation required penetrating security perimeters, evading guards, placing explosives with precision to maximize damage while minimizing risk of discovery before detonation, and then escaping through streets that would soon be swarming with German security forces searching for the saboteurs. The night of that operation remained etched in Gunnar's memory for the rest of his life. The careful approach through back streets and alleys, moving silently in the darkness, every sense alert for any sign of danger. The tension as they cut through the fence surrounding the target facility, knowing that any sound might bring guards running. The methodical placement of explosives, fingers working by touch in near total darkness, connecting detonators and setting timers. The withdrawal, forced to move calmly and naturally despite every instinct screaming to run. And then, blocks away, the deep thump of explosions, the flash of fire against the night sky, the immediate wail of sirens, the controlled terror of walking past German soldiers rushing toward the scene, maintaining the appearance of a curious bystander while fighting the urge to flee. These operations took a psychological toll. The tension before an operation was enormous, the risk during it acute, and the aftermath brought its own anxieties. Had they been seen? Had they left any evidence? Were the Germans already closing in? The only defense was to maintain normal routines, to appear utterly unconcerned, to give no hint that anything unusual had occurred. Gunnar became adept at this dissembling, able to chat casually with neighbors about the explosion even as his heart pounded and his mind raced through every detail of the operation, searching for potential compromises. But sabotage operations were only part of the resistance's work. Equally important was intelligence gathering, collecting information about German forces, movements, plans, and capabilities, and passing this information to London, where it could inform Allied strategic planning. Gunnar developed sources among Norwegians who worked in German administrative offices, in transportation hubs, in supply depots. These people, often at enormous personal risk, would pass along information about troop movements, shipping schedules, supply stockpiles, defensive preparations. The intelligence work required different skills than sabotage. It demanded patience, the ability to cultivate relationships gradually, the judgment to assess whether a potential source could be trusted. It required systems for securely communicating information, dead drops where messages could be left and retrieved, coded communications that would mean nothing to anyone who intercepted them, trusted couriers who could move information without arousing suspicion, and it required the discipline never to act on intelligence in ways that would reveal its source, even when the temptation to do so was overwhelming. One particular intelligence achievement, Gunnar was involved with concerned German naval operations from Norwegian ports. The resistance had developed sources among Norwegian dock workers and administrative personnel who had access to information about ship movements, cargo manifests, and repair schedules. This information was systematically collected, compiled, and transmitted to London, where it enabled the Royal Navy and RAF to plan attacks on German shipping with devastating effectiveness. Gunnar helped manage this network, coordinating the collection of information, ensuring its secure transmission, and managing the operational security that kept the sources protected. The personal cost of this work continued to mount. Gunnar was forced to maintain emotional distance from most people in his life, unable to form close relationships that might become vulnerabilities. He watched friends and colleagues get arrested, knowing he could do nothing to help without exposing himself and jeopardizing ongoing operations. He attended funerals of resistance members killed by the Germans, maintaining a carefully composed facade while rage and grief churned beneath the surface. He lived with the constant awareness that each day might be his last day of freedom, that any knock on the door might be the Gestapo coming to arrest him. Yet through it all, he maintained his operational effectiveness. He adapted to the Germans' evolving security measures, finding new ways to evade detection as they became more sophisticated in their counterintelligence work. He mentored newer resistance members, passing along the tradecraft and survival skills he had learned through hard experience. He maintained the meticulous operational discipline that kept his cell secure even as other cells were rolled up by German security forces. As 1943 arrived, the strategic situation continued to evolve. The Germans had been defeated at Stalingrad, marking the beginning of their long retreat on the Eastern Front. Allied forces were gaining the upper hand in North Africa and would soon invade Italy. The tide of the war was turning, slowly but unmistakably. Yet this brought new dangers for the Norwegian resistance. The Germans, increasingly desperate and brutal, intensified their security measures and their reprisals against resistance activity. The stakes of the game were rising, and the margin for error was shrinking. The Oslo Gang, leadership and legacy. By mid-1943, Gunnar Sønsteby had become one of the central figures in the Oslo resistance, though few outside the inner circles knew his identity. He operated under various aliases and cover identities, shifting between them as operational security required. To the Germans hunting resistance leaders, he was a phantom, known only by his activities and by the frustrating fact that he always managed to evade capture. To his fellow resistance members, he was a steady presence, a source of calm competence in circumstances that would have broken lesser men. It was during this period that the organization known as the Oslo Gang, Oslo Gang, took form around Gunnar and a small group of close associates. The Oslo Gang would become legendary in Norwegian resistance history, conducting some of the most daring and effective sabotage operations of the entire occupation. But the group's fame came later. At the time, it was simply a cell of committed operatives trying to strike effective blows against the occupation while surviving long enough to see liberation. The Oslo Gang specialized in high-risk, high-impact operations. They targeted German administrative centers, destroying records that the occupation authorities relied upon. They attacked transportation infrastructure, disrupting German supply lines. They struck at German personnel, though always with the careful discrimination that characterized Norwegian resistance, avoiding civilian casualties and focusing on legitimate military and political targets. Their operations were characterized by meticulous planning, bold execution, and remarkably successful exfiltration despite the intensive German response their attacks provoked. One of the gang's most significant operations targeted the Central Labor Registry, Arbeidstjenesten, that the Germans used to conscript Norwegian men for forced labor in Germany or in fortification projects in Norway. The registry contained detailed records on Norwegian citizens, and its destruction would significantly impair the Germans' ability to implement these conscription schemes. The building housing the registry was heavily guarded, located in a busy area where unusual activity would be immediately noticed, and the files were kept in secured rooms. It seemed like an almost impossible target. But Gunnar and his associates carefully planned the operation over several weeks. They identified the optimal time for the attack, late at night when the building would be minimally staffed, but not so late that anyone moving in the area would automatically be suspicious. They obtained German uniforms that would allow them to approach and enter the building with reduced suspicion. They secured the explosives needed not just to damage the building, but to ensure the complete destruction of the files. They planned multiple escape routes and arranged safe houses where they could shelter if immediate escape from the city became impossible. The operation itself was a masterpiece of controlled violence. The team, moving with practiced coordination, overwhelmed the minimal guard force, placed their explosives with precision, ensured that the resulting fire would consume the files, even if the explosives somehow failed to detonate fully, and withdrew before German reaction forces could respond. The building was destroyed, the labor registry eliminated, and the operation dealt a significant blow to German administrative control, while demonstrating that even heavily protected targets in the heart of Oslo were vulnerable to resistance attack. The Germans' fury at this attack was intense. They launched massive manhunts, conducted thousands of random checks and searches, arrested dozens of suspected resistance members, and made clear through brutal reprisals that such attacks would be met with savage retribution. Yet they could not find the perpetrators. Gunnar and his team had disappeared back into the anonymity of the city, resuming their cover identities, maintaining their normal routines, giving no hint of involvement in the attack that had humiliated the occupation authorities. This pattern would repeat itself multiple times over the following months. The Oslo Gang would strike seemingly at will, hitting targets throughout the city. German security forces would respond with ever more aggressive measures, but somehow Gunnar and his key associates remained free. Part of this was luck, the simple good fortune to never be in the wrong place at the wrong time when the Germans conducted their sweeps. Part was excellent tradecraft, the operational discipline that prevented compromises. But part was also Gunnar's almost uncanny ability to sense danger, to know when to change routines, when to go to ground, when a situation felt wrong in ways that could not be articulated but needed to be heeded. The personal toll on Gunnar during this period was immense. He was living on his nerves, never able to fully relax, always scanning for threats, always calculating risks and escape options. He slept little and ate less, running on nervous energy and the sense that he could not afford to slow down, could not afford to show weakness. He knew the Germans were closing in, knew that eventually his luck would run out, knew that capture would mean torture and death. Yet he continued, driven by a sense of obligation to his country, to his fellow resistance members, to the possibility of a future free from occupation. He also carried the burden of leadership. Other resistance members looked to him for guidance, for reassurance, for the steady presence that kept them functioning when fear threatened to paralyze. He had to make decisions that put others at risk, knowing that those decisions might result in their deaths. He had to maintain operational security even when that meant he could not warn people he cared about who were in danger. He had to appear confident and in control even when uncertainty and fear churned within him. Leadership in the resistance was not about inspiring speeches or grand gestures. It was about the grinding daily work of keeping the operation functioning, keeping people alive, keeping the struggle going one more day. As 1944 arrived, the end of the war was finally coming into view. The Allies had landed in Normandy in June, opening the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe. Soviet forces were driving into Eastern Europe, crushing German armies with massive offensives. Germany was being squeezed from both directions, and it was clear that eventual Allied victory was now a matter of when, not if. Yet for occupied Norway, liberation remained maddeningly distant. German forces in Norway were numerous and well entrenched, and the Allies' strategic priorities lay elsewhere. The Norwegian resistance would have to maintain its struggle for many more months, not knowing exactly when liberation would come, but knowing that until it did, the work of resistance had to continue. For Gunnar and the Oslo Gang, this meant continuing their sabotage operations, continuing to gather intelligence, continuing to disrupt German control wherever possible. But it also meant preparing for the endgame. When liberation finally came, the resistance would need to be ready to assist Allied forces, to prevent German destruction of Norwegian infrastructure, to maintain order during the transition period. Planning for this eventual liberation became an increasingly important part of the resistance's work, even as daily operations continued. The final year, endurance and liberation. The winter of 1944–45 was perhaps the most challenging period of the entire occupation. Everyone knew the war was ending, that Germany was being defeated, that liberation was coming. Yet that knowledge made the present suffering more acute rather than less. The Germans, increasingly desperate and vicious, intensified their terror tactics. Summary executions became more common. Reprisals against civilian populations grew harsher. The occupation authorities implemented food rationing that bordered on starvation, directing what resources remained primarily to German forces. Norwegian civilians faced cold, hunger, and the daily violence of an occupation force that knew its time was running out and seemed determined to inflict as much suffering as possible before its inevitable departure. For the resistance, this period required extraordinary endurance. The temptation to strike back with indiscriminate violence was strong, but the leadership understood that discipline had to be maintained. Resistance attacks still had to serve strategic purposes, had to target legitimate military and infrastructure targets, had to avoid providing the Germans with pretexts for even worse reprisals. This required a level of restraint that was almost superhuman given the circumstances. Gunnar and the Oslo Gang continued their operations throughout this period. They targeted German supply depots, destroying stockpiles that could have been used to prolong the occupation. They attacked communication infrastructure, degrading German ability to coordinate their forces. They gathered intelligence on German defensive preparations and evacuation plans, information that would prove crucial when liberation finally came. Each operation was conducted with the same meticulous planning and execution that had characterized their earlier work, though the increasing German desperation made every operation more dangerous. One particular operation during this period illustrated both the daring of the Oslo Gang and the extraordinary risks they were taking. The target was a building that housed Gestapo records. dossiers on suspected resistance members, interrogation reports, informant networks. The Germans guarded these files fanatically, understanding that their compromise would expose their intelligence-gathering apparatus and reveal the identities of Norwegian collaborators. The building was heavily guarded, located in a district where German security presence was intense, and the files were kept in reinforced vaults specifically designed to resist fire and explosives. Nevertheless, Gunnar and his team decided the target was worth the risk. The intelligence value of the files was enormous, and their destruction would protect resistance members who might be identified through German records. The operation required infiltration of the building itself, something far more dangerous than external sabotage. It meant overpowering guards silently, navigating the interior to reach the records, placing explosives that would breach the vaults, and then escaping from a building that would be immediately surrounded once the attack was detected. The operation was executed with precision born of years of experience. The team entered the building through a basement window whose regular patrol schedule they had meticulously documented. They moved through the corridors using diagrams they had painstakingly compiled from information provided by sources inside the German administrative structure. They reached the records room, overpowered the guards there, placed shaped charges on the vault doors, and retreated to cover before detonation. The explosions breached the vaults, and incendiary devices consumed the files. The team exfiltrated through a prepared route that took them through neighboring buildings and into a network of back alleys before German response forces could seal the area. The operation was a complete success, but it came at a cost. German reprisals were swift and brutal. Dozens of Norwegian civilians were arrested in random sweeps. Several resistance members from other cells were captured and executed, not because they had any connection to the operation, but simply because the Germans wanted to demonstrate that such attacks would be punished. Gunnar and his team had to live with the knowledge that their success had brought suffering to others, even though they knew rationally that responsibility lay with the Germans who chose to respond with collective punishment. This weight, the knowledge that resistance operations could provoke German violence against innocents, was one of the heaviest burdens the resistance carried. Some argued that it meant operations should be curtailed, that avoiding German reprisals was more important than striking back. But the leadership, including Gunnar, maintained that to accept this logic was to grant the Germans complete control, to allow the threat of reprisals to paralyze all resistance. The Germans bore sole moral responsibility for their atrocities, and the resistance could not allow that responsibility to be displaced onto those who chose to fight back. As spring 1945 arrived, events accelerated. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin. American and British forces were driving into Germany from the west. The Nazi regime was collapsing, and it was clear that the war in Europe would end within weeks. Yet for Norway, these final weeks were extraordinarily tense. No one knew what the Germans in Norway would do when Germany itself surrendered. Would they fight to the end? Would they attempt to destroy Norwegian infrastructure in a final spasm of vindictive rage? Would they turn their weapons on Norwegian civilians? The resistance prepared for various scenarios, ready to act to prevent as much destruction as possible when the moment came. Then, on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Word spread through Oslo with lightning speed, and the city erupted in celebration. Norwegian flags appeared everywhere, forbidden symbols during the occupation now flying openly in defiant joy. People poured into the streets, laughing, crying, embracing strangers, singing patriotic songs that had been sung only in whispers for 5 years. The occupation was over. Freedom had returned. For Gunnar Sønsteby, the moment brought a complex mixture of emotions: the overwhelming relief and joy at liberation, the almost disbelieving happiness at having survived when so many had not, but also exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness after 5 years of constant tension and danger, and grief for those who had not lived to see this day, for fellow resistance members who had been killed, for Norwegian civilians who had suffered and died under occupation. The celebration in the streets was appropriate and necessary, but Gunnar found himself almost unable to participate, too drained and too aware of the cost to fully join in the general euphoria. The aftermath: living with memory. The days following liberation were chaotic, as Norway began the complex process of transitioning from occupation to sovereignty. German forces surrendered their arms and were interned pending repatriation. The Norwegian government returned from exile in London, re-establishing Norwegian authority. Collaborators were arrested and would face trial for treason. The resistance, which had operated in shadows for 5 years, suddenly emerged into daylight, its members' activities and identities finally revealed. For Gunnar, this transition was profoundly disorienting. For 5 years, secrecy had been paramount, anonymity a survival necessity. Now suddenly he was being hailed as a hero, his exploits becoming public knowledge, his photograph appearing in newspapers. The contrast between his wartime existence, furtive, dangerous, isolated, and his post-war reality, public, celebrated, communal, was jarring. He had become accustomed to vigilance, to suspicion, to the assumption that any interaction might conceal danger. Learning to live without that constant tension, learning to trust again, learning to simply be a civilian in a free country, proved surprisingly difficult. The recognition that came to Gunnar after the war was extensive. He was awarded multiple decorations, both Norwegian and Allied, in recognition of his resistance work. He would eventually become the most highly decorated Norwegian citizen in history, receiving every Norwegian military honor as well as decorations from Britain, France, and other Allied nations. But these honors, while sincerely appreciated, were not what had motivated his resistance work. He had not fought for recognition or reward, but from conviction, from love of country, from the simple determination that occupation and injustice had to be resisted. The medals and accolades were acknowledgments of service, but they could not fully capture what that service had meant or what it had cost. Like many resistance veterans, Gunnar struggled with aspects of post-war adjustment. The skills that had kept him alive during the occupation, hypervigilance, suspicion, emotional detachment, risk assessment, were maladaptive in peacetime. Normal social interaction felt strange, almost threatening. The absence of danger was itself a kind of disorientation. After years of constant threat, peace felt unnatural. Many resistance veterans dealt with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, though in 1945 there was limited understanding or vocabulary for these psychological wounds. Gunnar also faced practical questions about his future. What does one do after spending one's formative adult years engaged in clandestine warfare? How does one translate the skills of sabotage and espionage into civilian employment? What career could possibly hold meaning after the intensity and purpose of resistance work? These were questions that many veterans faced, and the answers were not always obvious or satisfactory. Gunnar chose to pursue education, using the opportunity to complete his studies and eventually earning a degree. He worked in various capacities in the business sector, finding in the world of commerce and administration some outlet for his organizational abilities and meticulous attention to detail. He married, established a family, built a life that on the surface appeared entirely ordinary. But part of him remained forever marked by the war years, by the experiences that had shaped him more profoundly than anything else in his long life. He was also asked, frequently, to speak about his experiences. Schools wanted him to talk to students. Veterans organizations wanted his presence at commemorations. Historians wanted his testimony for the record. Journalists wanted interviews. Initially, Gunnar was reluctant, uncomfortable with the attention, unsure whether his experiences could be adequately conveyed to those who had not lived through the occupation. But gradually he came to understand that bearing witness was itself a form of service, that sharing the history of resistance was crucial to preserving that history and its lessons. When he did speak about his experiences, Gunnar was characteristically modest. He emphasized that he had been part of a collective effort, that many others had done as much or more, that those who had been captured and killed deserved greater recognition than those who had survived. He resisted the narrative that portrayed resistance as glamorous adventure, insisting on the fear, the uncertainty, the mundane brutality of occupation life. He wanted people to understand not just what the resistance had done, but why it had been necessary, what had been at stake, what values had been defended. Reflections on resistance, lessons, and a legacy. As the decades passed and Gunnar moved into his later years, his reflections on the resistance years deepened and matured. He had the perspective that only time and distance can provide, the ability to see his experiences in broader context and to draw from them insights that had not been fully clear in the moment. One of the themes Gunnar frequently returned to was the question of choice. He emphasized that resistance had not been inevitable, that many reasonable people had made different calculations and chosen different paths. Collaboration had been a real option, often incentivized by German policies that rewarded cooperation. Passive compliance had been another option, the path of simply keeping one's head down and trying to survive. Active resistance had been the most dangerous option, the one that offered the least personal benefit and the greatest personal risk. Why then had he chosen resistance? Gunnar's answer was neither dramatic nor ideological. He had simply been unable to accept the occupation's legitimacy, unable to live with himself if he collaborated or remained passive. It was a deeply personal calculus, rooted in his sense of self-worth and his understanding of what kind of person he wanted to be. He had not claimed moral superiority over those who made different choices, acknowledging that each person faced their own circumstances and their own limits. But for himself, the choice had been clear even if the path had been terrifying. Gunnar also reflected on what had made effective resistance possible. He emphasized the importance of organization, of coordination, of maintaining operational security. Spontaneous, disorganized resistance tended to be crushed quickly by superior German security forces. Effective resistance required planning, discipline, resources, intelligence, and above all, patience. The willingness to prepare carefully rather than act impulsively, to subordinate personal feelings to strategic necessity. But he also emphasized the importance of moral clarity. Resistance could not be sustained merely by tactical considerations. It required conviction, belief in the rightness of the cause. When fear and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm practical judgment, it was this moral foundation that kept resistance members functioning. They were not fighting for abstract principles alone, but for concrete values: freedom, dignity, justice, self-determination, that gave meaning to the suffering and sacrifice. Another theme in Gunnar's later reflections was the cost of resistance, not just to those who actively participated, but to Norwegian society as a whole. The occupation years had left deep scars, families torn apart, communities divided, trust damaged by the presence of collaborators and informers. The trials of collaborators after the war had been necessary, but also painful, forcing Norwegians to confront how many of their fellow citizens had sided with the occupiers. Rebuilding Norwegian society after liberation required not just material reconstruction, but also a kind of moral reconstruction, a working through of what had happened and what it meant. Gunnar's own role in this process of collective remembering was significant. By speaking openly about his experiences while also insisting on contextualizing them, by being honest about both the achievements and the costs of resistance, by refusing to mythologize or simplify what had been a complex and morally challenging experience, he helped Norwegians develop a mature understanding of their occupation history. His testimony, along with that of other resistance veterans, created a public record that preserved the memory of those years, while also drawing from that memory lessons relevant to subsequent generations. As Gunnar grew older, he also became increasingly concerned with ensuring that the lessons of Norwegian resistance were not lost. He understood that each generation must discover for itself why democratic values matter, why freedom is worth defending, why certain principles cannot be compromised regardless of the cost. The experience of occupation and resistance could not be simply transmitted. It had to be understood through imaginative engagement with what it had meant to live through those times. He was particularly concerned about addressing young people, helping them understand that the questions he had faced, questions about when to resist authority, when to prioritize principle over personal safety, when to stand against injustice even at great cost, were not unique to his historical moment. These were perennial human questions, and while the specific circumstances might differ, the fundamental moral challenges recurred in various forms across times and places. Gunnar also reflected on what the Norwegian resistance had achieved. In purely military terms, the contribution was modest. Norwegian sabotage operations had been significant, but not decisive. Norwegian intelligence valuable, but not war-winning. Yet he believed the resistance had achieved something crucial beyond military effects. It had maintained Norwegian dignity during the occupation, demonstrated that Norwegian will could not be broken by force, preserved a sense of national identity and continuity that made post-war reconstruction of Norwegian democracy possible. More broadly, the Norwegian resistance, along with resistance movements across occupied Europe, had demonstrated that totalitarian control was never absolute, that even overwhelming military force could not fully subjugate a determined population, that the human spirit possessed a resilience that exceeded even the most sophisticated mechanisms of oppression. These were lessons that had continuing relevance long after 1945, in contexts far removed from Nazi occupation, wherever people faced tyranny and had to decide how to respond. The man behind the legend. As Gunnar Sønsteby became an elder statesman of Norwegian history, invited to speak at commemorations and celebrations, consulted by historians and filmmakers, it would have been easy for the man to disappear behind the legend. The stories of his daring operations, his narrow escapes, his 5 years successfully evading German capture while conducting some of the most significant sabotage operations in Norway. These stories had become part of Norwegian national mythology. But those who knew Gunnar personally or heard him speak at length came away with a different impression, one of remarkable humility and groundedness. He never claimed to be special or uniquely heroic. When praised for his courage, he would point out that many people had demonstrated courage, that survival had involved considerable luck, that others who had been captured and killed despite being equally capable deserved greater recognition. He was uncomfortable with hagiography, with narratives that portrayed him as a fearless Superman. He insisted that he had been afraid, often terrified, that he had made mistakes, that some operations had failed, that he had lived with doubt and uncertainty throughout the occupation years. This humility was not false modesty, but reflected Gunnar's genuine understanding of his own limitations and the role of contingency in his survival. He knew how easily things could have gone differently, how many times he had escaped capture or death by the slimmest margins. He knew that some of his comrades who had been captured and executed had been no less skilled or cautious than he had been. That fate had simply dealt them worse luck. He refused to claim credit that belonged partly to fortune. Yet for all his modesty, Gunnar also possessed quiet pride in what he and his fellow resistance members had accomplished. They had stood against overwhelming power. They had maintained their integrity when compliance would have been easier and safer. They had contributed, in their way, to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany and the liberation of Norway. They had demonstrated that ordinary people, with no special training or resources beyond their determination and ingenuity, could resist tyranny effectively. These were genuine achievements, worthy of recognition even if Gunnar was uncomfortable with personal accolades. Those who knew Gunnar in his later years describe a man of remarkable vitality and engagement. He remained intellectually active, following current events, reading widely, interested in contemporary challenges. He maintained physical fitness through outdoor activities, still skiing in the mountains well into old age, maintaining his connection to the Norwegian landscape that had shaped him. He was a devoted family man, finding in his children and grandchildren the continuity and meaning that transcended his own individual experiences. He also maintained connections with his fellow resistance veterans, attending reunions and commemorations, preserving friendships forged in the crucible of occupation. These gatherings served both social and therapeutic functions. They were opportunities to reminisce, to honor those who had not survived, to share experiences with the only people who could truly understand what those years had been like. The bond between resistance veterans was unique, based on shared experiences that set them apart from everyone else, even from their own families who could never fully comprehend what they had lived through. As Gunnar entered his final years, he became increasingly conscious of his role as a living link to history. The occupation was receding into the past, its veterans aging and passing away, its memory dependent on historical records and second-hand accounts. He took seriously his responsibility to bear witness, to ensure that the reality of those years was preserved as accurately as possible, to counter both romanticization and trivialization of what occupation and resistance had meant. He worked with historians, sitting for extensive interviews, reviewing manuscripts, providing corrections and context for accounts of the resistance years. He insisted on accuracy, pushing back against narratives that simplified or distorted what had happened. He wanted the historical record to be faithful to the complexity of the experience, to acknowledge both achievements and failures, to present resistance as human activity rather than mythological accomplishment. Final years and passing. The end of an era. Gunnar Sønsteby lived a long life, surviving well into the 21st century. He witnessed extraordinary changes in Norway and the world. The Cold War, decolonization, technological revolution, the emergence of new global challenges. He saw Norway transform from a war-ravaged nation into one of the world's most prosperous and peaceful countries. He watched as the generation that had experienced occupation was succeeded by generations for whom World War II was history rather than memory, abstract knowledge rather than lived experience. His longevity meant that he remained a public figure for decades after the war, a living connection to Norway's most challenging period. He received countless honors and accolades. Documentaries were made about his life. Books were written about his exploits. Schools and buildings were named after him. He became, in a very real sense, a national treasure, representing values and experiences that Norwegians wanted to preserve and honor. Yet Gunnar remained fundamentally the same person he had always been: modest, thoughtful, more comfortable with action than with words, more interested in accuracy than in adulation. When asked about his advanced age and continued health, he would credit the mountains and the skiing, the physical fitness he had maintained throughout his life. When asked about the secret of his longevity, he would joke that stubbornness and luck had kept him alive during the occupation and seemed to be doing the same in peace. As he entered his 90s, then passed his 100th birthday, Gunnar became one of the last surviving members of his generation of resistance fighters. The commemorations he attended took on increasingly elegiac tones, gatherings to honor not just what had been achieved, but what was passing away. The living memory of the occupation years was fading, and with it, something that could never be fully replaced by historical records, however detailed. Gunnar Fridtjof Thurman Sønsteby passed away on May 10, 2012, at the age of 94. His death was marked by national mourning in Norway. The flags flew at half-mast. Political leaders issued statements honoring his life and service. Newspapers published extensive obituaries celebrating his contributions to Norwegian freedom. A state funeral was held, attended by members of the royal family, government officials, veterans, and ordinary citizens who wanted to pay their respects to a man who had become a symbol of Norwegian resistance and resilience. The funeral was held with full military honors, reflecting Gunnar's status as a war hero. His coffin was draped with the Norwegian flag he had fought to defend. Veterans, now elderly themselves, stood at attention as the coffin passed, rendering final salutes to a comrade who had embodied the values they had all struggled to uphold. The ceremony was solemn, but also celebratory, honoring not just a long life concluded, but a life well lived, a life of meaning and purpose that had made a genuine difference. In the tributes that followed, speakers emphasized different aspects of Gunnar's legacy. Some focused on his military achievements, the specific operations he had conducted, and their impact on the war effort. Others emphasized his moral example, the way he had maintained integrity under extraordinary pressure. Still others highlighted his post-war contributions, his work in preserving the memory of the resistance and ensuring its lessons remained relevant to new generations. But perhaps the most moving tributes came from ordinary Norwegians who had never met Gunnar, but who understood what he represented. In letters to newspapers and in online forums, people wrote about what his life meant to them, how his example had inspired them, how his story had helped them understand their own history, how his integrity and courage served as a reminder of what human beings were capable of at their best. These testimonials spoke to the fact that Gunnar's legacy transcended his individual accomplishments. He had become a symbol of values that remained vital and necessary. Legacy and relevance. Lessons for our time. Now, as we conclude our evening's reflection on the life of Gunnar Sønsteby, it is worth considering what his story might mean for us today, in a world very different from the one in which he fought. The specific circumstances of Nazi occupation may seem remote. The particular challenges he faced may appear unique to that historical moment. Yet beneath the surface details, Gunnar's story speaks to timeless questions about courage, integrity, resistance to injustice, and the responsibilities we bear as individuals and as members of communities. One of the most relevant lessons from Gunnar's life concerns the nature of courage. We often imagine courage as dramatic, as the absence of fear, as some kind of extraordinary quality that only special people possess. But Gunnar's courage was different. It was the ability to act despite fear, to fulfill responsibilities even when terrified, to maintain function under circumstances that would justify paralysis. His courage was not innate but cultivated, developed through practice and through commitment to principles that transcended self-interest. This understanding of courage is particularly relevant in contemporary contexts, where we may not face life or death choices, but do face choices about integrity, about whether to speak up or remain silent, about whether to take personal risks for broader principles. Gunnar's example suggests that courage is not reserved for extreme circumstances, but is rather a quality we can develop and exercise in the course of ordinary life, that the small choices about integrity and principle prepare us for larger challenges if they arise. Another lesson concerns the importance of moral clarity combined with practical judgment. Gunnar was neither an ideological zealot nor a cynical opportunist. He had clear principles. Occupation was wrong, tyranny must be resisted, freedom and dignity were worth fighting for. But he combined these principles with pragmatic assessment of how to act effectively. He understood that good intentions were not enough, that resistance required planning, skill, discipline, and willingness to subordinate emotional satisfaction to strategic effectiveness. This combination of moral clarity and practical wisdom is perpetually relevant. We live in complex times when many issues do not present themselves with the stark simplicity of occupation and resistance. Yet we still face situations where principles matter, where power is abused, where injustice demands response. Gunnar's example suggests that effective response to such situations requires both clarity about values and sophisticated judgment about how to act on those values in complex circumstances. The story of Gunnar Sønsteby also reminds us of the importance of individual agency. It would have been easy for him to conclude that as one person, he could not make a difference against the overwhelming power of German occupation. It would have been rational to decide that personal survival was paramount, that resistance was futile, that the sensible course was to keep one's head down and wait for liberation to come from external forces. But Gunnar rejected this calculus, understanding that collective resistance was built from individual choices, that his actions mattered even if their impact was difficult to measure, that maintaining integrity was itself a form of victory regardless of strategic outcomes. This lesson about individual agency is particularly important in contemporary contexts, where large-scale problems, political, environmental, social, can induce feelings of helplessness. Gunnar's life suggests that individual action matters, that one person willing to act on principle can inspire others, that collective movements emerge from the accumulated decisions of individuals who refuse to accept that they are powerless. His example is an antidote to the paralysis that cynicism induces. We might also draw from Gunnar's story insights about the nature of freedom and why it is worth defending. Freedom, in Gunnar's understanding, was not merely the absence of constraint, but the presence of human dignity, the ability to live according to one's own values and convictions, the space to make choices without coercion. The occupation threatened freedom in this deeper sense. It demanded conformity, punished independent thought, sought to remake Norwegian society according to an alien ideology. This understanding of freedom remains vital. We continue to face threats to freedom, though they may take forms different from military occupation. Wherever power seeks to constrain conscience, wherever ideology demands absolute conformity, wherever dignity is denied, the fundamental issues Gunnar confronted remain relevant. His life reminds us that freedom is not a given, that it must be defended in each generation, that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance and occasional sacrifice. Finally, Gunnar's story speaks to the importance of memory and historical consciousness. He understood that remembering the occupation years was crucial not for purposes of vindictiveness or national mythology, but because that memory contained lessons that each generation needed to learn anew. He insisted on accurate, honest memory that acknowledged complexity rather than simplifying history into comfortable narratives. He recognized that memory was work, requiring active engagement rather than passive reception. This understanding of memory's importance is particularly crucial now, as we move further from the events of World War II and as direct witnesses pass away. How do we maintain meaningful connection to history whose participants are no longer alive? How do we preserve not just factual knowledge but understanding of what historical events meant to those who lived through them? How do we learn from history without distorting it? These questions, which Gunnar grappled with in his later years, remain urgent for us. Closing reflections. A life well lived. As we draw toward the end of our time together tonight, let us return once more to the essential elements of Gunnar Sønsteby's story. A young man, ordinary in most respects, found himself living in extraordinary times. He faced choices that tested every aspect of his character: his courage, his integrity, his judgment, his endurance. He made the difficult choice to resist rather than comply, to risk everything rather than accept injustice, to maintain his principles even when doing so might cost him his life. For 5 years, he lived on the edge, conducting operations that struck real blows against the occupation, gathering intelligence that aided the Allied war effort, maintaining networks that kept resistance alive. He survived when many did not, through a combination of skill, caution, and fortune. When liberation finally came, he faced the different but real challenges of readjusting to peace, of building a normal life after years of extraordinary danger, of living with memories that could not be fully shared with those who had not experienced them. In his later years, he bore witness, helping to preserve the memory of occupation and resistance, insisting on honesty and accuracy in how that history was remembered. He became a symbol of values that transcended his personal experiences: courage, integrity, dedication to freedom, unwillingness to accept injustice. And when he finally passed, at an advanced age, having lived to see the better world his struggles had helped create, his death marked not just the loss of an individual, but the passing of a generation, the fading of living memory into history. Yet Gunnar's life was not ultimately about the dramatic events of the occupation years, important as those were. It was about how he chose to live in every circumstance, with integrity, with courage, with commitment to principles that transcended self-interest. It was about maintaining humanity in dehumanizing circumstances, about preserving hope when despair would have been understandable, about never accepting that might makes right or that tyranny is inevitable. His life demonstrated that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite fear, that resistance to injustice is possible even under the most oppressive conditions, that individual choices accumulate into collective movements that can change the course of history. These lessons, drawn from his specific experiences, have universal relevance, speaking to fundamental questions about how we should live, what we should value, what we are willing to sacrifice for principle. As you prepare for rest tonight, perhaps you might reflect on Gunnar Sønsteby's story and what it might mean for your own life. You likely will never face circumstances as extreme as Nazi occupation. You probably will not be called upon to risk your life for freedom. But you will face choices about integrity and principle, about whether to speak up or remain silent, about whether to act on your convictions or to let convenience and self-interest guide your decisions. In those moments, however different they may be from Gunnar's circumstances, his example offers guidance. The example of someone who chose integrity over safety, principle over convenience, resistance over compliance. Let his story serve as a reminder that we are not powerless, that individual choices matter, that courage is possible, that even in the darkest times, human dignity can be preserved. Let it remind you that the values we claim to hold, freedom, justice, human dignity, require defense, that they are not self-sustaining, but depend on people willing to stand up for them when they are threatened. Let it remind you that history is not just something that happens to us, but something we participate in creating through our choices and actions. And perhaps most importantly, let Gunnar Sønsteby's life remind you that a life of meaning and purpose is possible, that we can make a difference in ways large and small, that the question is not whether we face challenges, but how we respond to them. Not whether we have opportunities for courage, but whether we recognize and embrace them when they appear. His was a life well lived, not perfect, not without struggle and sacrifice, but animated by principles that gave it direction and meaning, by commitments that transcended personal interest, by a determination to do what was right regardless of cost. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you the knowledge that Gunnar Sønsteby's story, like all great stories of human courage and resilience, is not just about one person in one time and place. It is about the potential that exists in all of us, the capacity for courage and integrity that we all possess if we choose to cultivate and exercise it. It is about the eternal human struggle between tyranny and freedom, between oppression and dignity, between accepting injustice and resisting it. And it is about the fact that in that struggle, individual choices matter, that each of us has a role to play, that the question is never whether we can make a difference, but whether we will try. Rest well tonight, knowing that the world has been blessed by people like Gunnar Sønsteby, who when tested by history rose to the challenge, who chose courage over fear, integrity over expedience, resistance over submission, and know that his legacy lives on, not primarily in monuments or medals, but in the inspiration his life provides to all who hear his story and resolve, in their own circumstances and in their own ways, to live with the same commitment to principle, the same courage in the face of challenge, the same determination to stand for what is right even when doing so is difficult or dangerous. The night is quiet now, and it is time for rest. But tomorrow will bring its own challenges and opportunities. When they come, may you face them with some measure of the courage, integrity, and determination that characterized Gunnar Sønsteby's remarkable life. May his story remind you that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that courage is possible, that resistance to injustice is always an option, that one person can indeed make a difference. And may you sleep well, cradled in the knowledge that humanity at its best, as exemplified by people like Gunnar Sønsteby, is capable of remarkable nobility, resilience, and grace. Good night, and may your rest be peaceful and restorative, filled with dreams that honor the best of what human beings can be when we choose courage over fear, principle over convenience, and hope over despair. The story of Gunnar Sønsteby is now part of your consciousness, a reminder of what is possible, an inspiration for your own journey, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Carry it with you, let it guide you, and know that his legacy continues in all who hear his story and resolve to live with integrity, courage, and unwavering commitment to human dignity and freedom. Sleep well.